Hello and welcome back to Bossing Chat GPT with Mr. F, where artificial intelligence is taken to not just the next level, but the one after that. Just kidding. Of course, it's some more Section A madness for all you OCR peeps who are sweating it with a month-ish to go to the exam. I've done one of these already that seems to have been quite popular. The reason I'm coming back to it is there are more things to say that I didn't say in that video, and I have a specific extract that hasn't come up. Who knows if the gods are smiling on us all? This may be the one, but it's well chosen because of the fact that I'll be able to talk about the things that I didn't talk about in the previous video. Seamless, brilliant. The seamless brilliance of Mr. F continues. That's what makes him the original Bossman of English. All right, enough pre-ramble, waffling. Preamble, isn't it? It's not a pre-ramble. It's a preamble. Okay, so here we have a extract from Act 4, Scene 3 of Hamlet. And in this scene, we have Claudius, who is now painfully aware of the threat posed to him by Hamlet, coming to terms with that threat, on edge, but also in Machiavellian mode, plotting, planning, thinking of the way to handle this threat to his crown. Claudius having become previously aware in Act 4, Scene 1 through Gertrude telling him about Hamlet having stabbed Polonius through the arras, through the curtain. A really interesting scene because we have Hamlet and Claudius in dialogue together in private. And what I'm going to just mention before we get into this is when you're looking at Section A's, you don't have a lot of time. It's basically 37.5 minutes. If you do it literally a 50-50 split with Section B, of course you might spend a few more minutes on Section A or Section B, depending on where your strengths lie. Or you could spend a bit more on both, like do 40 and 40 and spend a bit less on Section B, as in, you know, the, say for example, it was Ibsen, Rossetti. You could choose to steal 5 minutes from that to put on the Shakespeare if you wanted to. These are the decisions you have to make during the exam. But honestly, sometimes I think we can... Previously I said it's a kind of close critical analysis, almost like forensic detail going from start to finish, and that's true. But sometimes I think there are obvious things that if we look at an extract and we see it there, we might understand that we would be expected to comment on it. So for instance, in this one, if I look at it like the bigger picture of this extract, there are certain things that are happening that I think are of interest immediately. We have a kind of mini soliloquy. Although it says enter King Claudius attended, the things he says in this soliloquy suggest that as far as he's concerned, he's telling us his private thoughts. He's airing his private thoughts in public to us as an audience. That makes it a soliloquy, even though there are other people on stage who can hear him. They're not important people, and they're not influencing what he can and can't say. So there's a soliloquy in blank verse, and we can tell that because if we're struggling with blank verse versus prose, the easiest way to spot that is if, I'll just get a nice pretty colour here. Let's do purple. Oops. Yeah, that's exactly what I didn't want to do. Every line starts with a capital letter, right? That's the easiest way to spot it. And obviously you might get various line lengths. There may even be rhymes, but usually they come at the end of a scene. But that's the obvious way. Obviously blank verse tends to be iambic pentameter. Sometimes that's broken for specific reasons to add emphasis on specific words. So you can look for iambic pentameter roughly, because sometimes it's uneven, and certainly look for capital letters at the start of the line. And then in contrast to that, in this particular scene, we can see that later on, I've already highlighted that with light red, pink even, you can see prose here. Yeah, this is going well, isn't it? I might have to chop some of that. I wanted that to be an arrow, but it doesn't seem to want me to do an arrow, so I'm going to... all that will disappear in the edit. Now in this extract, what we can also see is prose being used by Hamlet. So we've got the king speaking in blank verse and Hamlet choosing to speak in prose. We'll look at that in a bit more detail, but that's obvious. So if I look at this from a bigger picture point of view, I see it starts off with a soliloquy in blank verse by the king, and I can see Hamlet choosing to speak in prose when engaging in dialogue with the king. So immediately I've got a juxtaposition there between use of blank verse by one character who's the top of the hierarchy, he's regal, the king, and the prince, who's also high up in the hierarchy, who's choosing to use this casual register, and more extraordinarily when speaking to the king, which is not something we would expect him to do. So I think there's something interesting. Now, again, for those of you who struggle with this, how can I tell that that's prose? Well, if you look, let me just change the colour so I get some consistency here. It's in that pink. You can see it's like long lines like you'd find in a novel. So it's like novel length lines. And there are no capital letters at the start of each line. And at the end here, you can just see that the lines run on in this kind of, it's almost type of enjambment, isn't it, with no punctuation at the end. And, it's fairly obvious. There's another one there. And there's more here. So we can see that, this is a conscious decision by Hamlet when speaking to the king at this moment. So I think that's important. Now, that then gets us onto this thing called registers and different types of register. And as you can see here, one person who has written about this is Professor Martin Juice. You don't need to mention that, but he's just going to help us think about the different types of registers that you can find in discourse, right? Public discourse or private discourse. So a frozen register would be one that is very set and prescriptive and you can't really change, such as when a priest recites the Lord's Prayer, it's always the same, or when a policeman arrests you, or police person arrests you, it's always the same set phrase that they have to use. And then we have this formal speech, which is what we see Claudius adopting, which is formal speech specialised often to address large groups. So think about when Claudius addresses the court in Act 1, Scene 2 in his first public appearance. There we get the formal speech, and he's addressing a large group, frequently in blank verse in drama. So there we are, we see that happening there. We have this other register called consultative, which is a mixture of formal and casual, sometimes verse, sometimes prose. And then we get casual, which we see Hamlet choosing to adopt here. Chatty or casual language used in close friendship groups, usually in prose. Now, what's funny about this is clearly we know how Hamlet feels about Claudius, so we're not dealing with close friendship. So this to me feels like something rebellious, like a slight. Since there's no one else around, it's a private conversation, but Hamlet is using it to kind of slight his stepfather in this particular moment. A final register that you could comment on is intimate, between two people, lovers or twins, tight, close-knit, can be in verse or prose, can be lyrical or poetic. This might include coded text messages, pet names. We might think of some of the exchanges between Hamlet and Ophelia in this way. Possibly it might be more consultative, a mixture of blank verse and prose. Ophelia is generally very formal and respectful and deferent towards Hamlet, whereas Hamlet is often very crude and baldy and uses lots of innuendo in this taunting relationship he has with her. Okay, so there's definitely something that I could say about, if I'm analysing this as a section A, I'd want to address the use of blank verse by the king and prose by Hamlet in this scene. And then there are other interesting things here as well. Interestingly, when we see Rosencrantz engaging in discussion with Claudius, he is very formal himself. Okay, so we can contrast Hamlet's maybe irreverent, willfully perverse or willfully kind of belligerent use of prose here, with Rosencrantz's deference. So Rosencrantz is adopting the correct formal register when speaking to the king, using blank verse and referring to him as my lord several times. So there's another bit of juxtaposition between the correct way to speak to the king and Hamlet's willfully incorrect way to speak to the king. The other thing we must remember, which I haven't said up to now, is not only is Hamlet speaking in prose perhaps from a willful desire to be, to use like incorrect formality, to be deliberately informal in a way to slight the king. He's also adopting an antic disposition, and much of what Hamlet is saying here, although on the surface it appears nonsensical, is also actually quite insulting to the king in a kind of veiled, guarded way. We get references to how kings and beggars are basically the same because they both become worm food, and it's a way of saying all humanity is equal because they all end up as worm food. And of course, obviously, the king is supposed to be divinely appointed and almost God's representative on earth, in a way, a bit like the Pope. And by making this kind of perverse equilibrium, by making this perverse equality between a beggar and a king, it's again Hamlet's way of using wordplay to insult the king. So it's the antic disposition manifesting itself in prose and in wordplay, but in a way that is obscures insults aimed at Claudius in this moment. And I think Hamlet delights in that because he has a prodigious wit and intelligence that needs maybe this outlet at this moment. Plus he needs to perform that role of antic disposition to appear mad. Okay, a further thing that we haven't talked about, or I haven't talked about, is the use of thou and you. I will link to a very useful web page which has further information on this. But there's a nice little, from that web page, there's a nice little table here which kind of illustrates the different uses. So if you are a French speaker, you will know that there are different ways of saying you, or there are other, I think this applies to other European languages. So we have the tu form and the vous form. The tu was very informal and between close friends, and you're often invited to tutoyer quelqu'un, someone, whereas the vous voyez is distant, formal, public, and it preserves a kind of status between people, and it's like a social protocol of, I don't know you well enough to tutoyer you, so I'm going to vous voyer you. There we are. Little French lesson for you there. And English used to have this as well. We have the equivalent of the tu form is thou, and the equivalent of the vous formal would be you. And of course this can be used in different ways. So the thou can be used to social inferiors, so it can be a way of talking down to someone, to social equals of a lower class, in private, to express familiarity or intimacy, and to show scorn or contempt. So that's something that we need to be, I'm just going to change my colour here, that's something that we need to be mindful of, that this can be done the hierarchies attached to this language can be used willfully to make a kind of critique or social comment, i.e. showing scorn or contempt. I'm having trouble with that today, aren't I? Now, you is the opposite. It's used mainly to social superiors, to social equals if you're in the upper class, in public, to express formality or neutrality, and to show respect or admiration. Now, if we look at the use of you and thou in this particular scene, we can see that Hamlet refers to, I'll just get rid of that top one because I don't think it's the best example. Let me get rid of that there. In heaven send hither to see. If your messenger find him not there, seek him in the other place yourself. I'll just keep adding a bit more there. As you go up, you can see there's a lot of it. You shall nose him as you go up the stairs into the lobby. So Hamlet is deciding to adopt this formality or neutrality when speaking to his stepfather. Now, we might think of that as appropriate. Technically, he's his social superior as well. We have the prince and we have the king. But it also feels quite cold and reserved, doesn't it? And I think that that's what Hamlet is going for, showing, keeping a distance between someone who professes love and admiration and, fatherly feelings towards Hamlet. And Hamlet is rejecting that by preserving this formality and neutrality and cool language of distance. Claudius, on the other hand, really goes over the top with the use of thou. Hamlet, this deed for thine especial safety, which we do tender as we dearly grieve, for that which thou hast done, therefore prepare thyself. And we can see, so it is, if thou knewest our purposes. This is slightly different because this is a weird, almost like boast about, it's like a sinister cackle. Ha ha ha! If you really knew what I was planning, you wouldn't think that. Which he says in full hearing of Hamlet. We can see that. I'll probably go through my model answer for this question, and I kind of explain that a bit there. I think Claudius is a great actor in this play, as in acting, playing a part, playing a role from the very get-go. In Act 1, Scene 2, when he has to pretend to be the rightful king, and he adopts the language of the king, which we still see him using here. He's using the royal we. I'm going to change the colour, funnily enough. He uses the royal we there, and us. He uses us somewhere else. Our purposes there. So he's using the royal we. So even here, he's adopting the language of the king, which is another register, isn't it, of formality, maybe even, of formality for that public discourse where he's expected to speak in the royal first person plural. He kind of tries to kill him with kindness here with the overuse of thou, thine, thyself, to show familiarity or intimacy with Hamlet and that fatherly feeling, which Hamlet rejects. Now, all we really looked at there is the different registers being used, the use of formal versus casual, blank verse versus prose, and the use of thou and you. We've added in a little bit about Rosencrantz's use of my lord to contrast it with Hamlet's casual register as well. So I think I'd probably comment on that if I was doing this, but I'd have to come in and look at some of the language here because there's lots of interesting language, such as the alliterative plosives at the end of that soliloquy, diseases desperate grown by desperate appliance are relieved, and what that gives there. How Claudius is quite dismissive with this metaphor, the distracted multitude who like not in their judgment but their eyes. So there's this kind of contempt and scorn shown towards public opinion. I'd explore in more detail Hamlet's interesting wordplay with the idea of worms and worm food and this kind of coarse language of maggots and the antitheses of fat king and lean beggar. I'd explore that. I'd explore this kind of public cackle, which is quite sinister and villain-like, which I think is part of Claudius's character. The dramatic effect of that would be he is showing, and I think he's done that from Act 1, Scene 2, where seeing how far he can go. He's brazen. He sometimes says things in a brazen way, as if he's already got away with the impossible, i.e. regicide or fratricide, essentially regicide, of killing old Hamlet. So now he just thinks, I can get away with anything and I can be as brazen as I want in public and no one can touch me. And I think that's that kind of overreach of the villain there. And then at the end, this is a really good addition to that use of thy loving father, Hamlet. And Hamlet rather chooses to think about his mother. So even though she's not in this scene, she's in his mind, and she's referred to here, which again, dramatic effect could be that Hamlet is often thinking about his mother and is rejecting, and maybe in an Oedipal way, this surrogate father who has fulfilled his, Oedipal wishes of killing the father and sleeping with the mother. I don't think you need to get into that really, because it's a bit AO5y, but certainly the why is he thinking about Gertrude here? It's another rejection of the stepfather. Anyway, the use of thy is interesting there. And then we get Claudius on his own again. So it starts and ends with a soliloquy. That's a kind of interesting structural feature. So at the end, we get that structural circularity with a soliloquy at the start and at the end. And we also get a reference to disease as a metaphor. Like the hectic in my blood, he rages. So this is it's kind of ironic, isn't it, that they both come to the same conclusion, that Claudius is the rot, is the disease, is the weed in the garden of Elsinore, and likewise for Claudius, Hamlet is the hectic, the disease in his blood that rages. We get some use of the imperatives and this strange command to England, and this speaking to England, addressing England as if it were a person, so that personification that you could explore. And again, interesting use of thou in this, with this personification, this kind of imaginary dialogue with the country, where he hopes they will fulfill his wishes sent in the letter to have Hamlet killed, finally ending with a rhyming couplet that you could explore as well. Right, there we are. I'll probably save, because that's already quite long, isn't it? I'll probably save the model answer for a second video, and I'll just go through that and show you how I've structured it with a very brief kind of explanation of what this scene is about, and then going straight into prolonged close critical analysis, but also looking at the use of registers and the use of you and thou alongside language structure as well. I think the registers would come under form in this instance. All right, so will be part 2. So there we are. Okay, so you can expect that to appear in the coming days, and you know what to do. Like you like, subby sub, and I'll be back shortly with more Felicity. Bye for now.